Fear, it's everywhere in our society. We tend to fear things like losing our job. We fear failure, what the future may hold. And of course, a lot of people fear getting sick and dying, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining us now to talk about how to overcome our fears is Pastor Kelly Stickel, the lead pastor of My Victory Churches in Lethbridge and Southern Alberta. Welcome back to Bridge City News, Pastor Kelly.
Thanks for having me, Hal. It's great to be here.
You bet. I'm not sure we've ever seen this kind and this level of fear before in our lifetime, especially in my lifetime. Now, some fears can be justified, but do you think a lot of the fears we have are somewhat irrational or even unjustified?
Yeah, I would say that probably the majority of the fear that we have as human beings is unjustified. We have this magical way of having our brains just drift off into what ifs and the unknowns, and a lot of those things we will conjure up, and the more we focus on them and pander to those what ifs, those imaginations, the worse it gets. And I think just human nature for all of us is that we do battle fear, and the majority of those fears would definitely be irrational.
Now, Pastor Kelly, some people might argue, listen, I'm not afraid, I'm just a little concerned here. So in your opinion, what's the difference between fear and simply being concerned about something?
Yeah, I think when, again, concern is healthy, and fear, there's a healthy part of fear that is, we want to be cautious, and it's a protective mechanism for all of us. So having concern is good. But I think when you dwell on concern and probably put your focus there and your weight on concern, it easily drifts into irrational fear, and we go beyond just being cautious to being imprisoned by and locked down by fear. And I think when it crosses over into fear with concern, you should still be able to move ahead. But fear is going to actually cause you to pause and to either fight or flight or freeze. And I think it's important for us. We don't want to get into a place where we just stop and we don't move ahead and we don't progress. And that's when it becomes, I think, dangerous fear.
You know, you hit the nail on the head. Sometimes people are so afraid, so fearful that they just stay where they are. They don't move. They don't progress or move forward, like you said. Now, there are differing views on how to respond to the COVID-19 situation. Now, but whatever an individual's opinion may be on wearing masks or getting vaccinated, what advice do you have for those who are living in a constant state of fear?
Well, I'm not going to take sides on masks or no masks or any of that. But when it comes to dealing with fear is unhealthy. In my opinion, it's a deadly virus in and of itself. And I say that because it continually grows. It doesn't seem to go away. It dwells unless you intentionally address it and move beyond that. But in order to move beyond fear, I think one of the biggest things that we need to be able to do is as a Christian, we should put our trust in God. And a lot of times our fear is based on the unknown or the uncertainty. And that's certainly what's going on now, is the uncertainty of the virus, the uncertainty of the economy, the uncertainty of school and protection, and all the crazy stuff that's going on right now creates this uncertainty, and uncertainty feeds fear. But ultimately, as Christians, our trust needs to be in God. And there's a lot of what ifs we can't answer right now, a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainties. But ultimately, God has not left the throne. God has nothing's outside of his control. And ultimately, to overcome our fear, it's looking to him and saying, okay, I trust you, and what that you are still in control.
Do we tend to believe our circumstances more than believing in what God has truly promised for our lives?
Absolutely. I think just human nature for all of us, that we will focus on our circumstance, because our circumstance, let's just be real, that's what's tangible right in front of us. That's what we see, touch, sense. And that's, right there. And so because it's so prevalent in our lives and so right there, when you're going through a disease, you feel the pain. Well, that's a circumstance. You feel that. So to say, I'm feeling pain, can I still have faith in God? Yes. But you actually have to take your mind and saying, I'm going to look beyond what I see, feel, sense, and I've got to still trust that and lean on God and trust him.
So, Pastor Kelly, why do you think so many people fear death? And how can we get to the point of faith that we trust God so much that we actually are okay with the prospect of dying?
Well, as believers, I mean, Paul addressed this multiple times in the Bible, and he was addressing a church that was facing threats of death every single day just for being believers. And so it's a very real fear. And I think the reason why we fear death is because it's the great unknown. It's we just don't know, and aren't, and certainly our minds can play tricks on us because we don't know. We've never been there. What's going to happen, and how's it going to happen? And we all have our speculations. But what Paul said, to the believers, and what the writer of Hebrews said as well, is that especially the writer of Hebrews said that this hope is an anchor for our soul. The hope that he was referring to is the resurrection of Jesus, and the fact that because of the resurrection of Jesus, that means that there is eternal life for us. And a lot of times, the death and the fear of death, we have to go past the unknowns to get to what we do know. Well, Jesus did, as believers, we believe Jesus did rise again from the dead, and because of that, it's not there's different definitions of hope. And hope can be wishful thinking, or hope can be absolute certainty. And when we lean into the resurrection of Jesus, we have absolute certainty that our eternities are sealed, and we need to sometimes place our mind there and go, no, that I know where I'm going. Amen. When I die, and that erases that fear.
So what are the consequences of living in fear? And how does this impact the way we live our daily lives, outside of maybe getting an ulcer, having to deal with that, and having to deal with high blood pressure?
Well, funny story that you bring up high blood pressure, because I'll just be a little bit vulnerable here. I came to we talked about fear being irrational, and I had, for the longest time, my mom about 12 years ago passed away from a battle with cancer. And when you watch someone so close to you die, cancer is a terrible disease. It's a merciless disease, and it's tragic to someone to pass away from, but what it does to the body and all the rest of it. Well, that I didn't realize, after mourning her, I didn't realize that it created this fear inside of me of cancer and of that. And so I had this fear of doctors. And a couple of years ago, I went to the doctor, and the doctor says to me, he says, "You've got crazy high blood pressure, and alarmingly so. We're gonna have to get you on medication like right away." And he sent me home with this blood pressure machine. I was like, man, I felt healthy. I work out all the time. I eat properly. Like, I was like, what is the problem? And it's funny, I took the blood pressure machine home and plugged it in, and my blood pressure was, be like at the very healthiest level that it possibly could be all throughout the week. And so I brought it back into the doctor, and the doctor, he's like, you know what the problem is? He said, Kelly, he says, this machine, he says, the problem is you're afraid of me. And I went, what? And he said, when you walked into here, your heart rate ran up, your blood pressure, to the place where it increased your blood pressure to an unhealthy level. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it kind of hit me right in the face. And I walked out. I was like, why am I afraid? Well, I was afraid of going to the doctor. Talk about irrational fear. I was afraid of going to the doctor because of him diagnosing and saying, well, you have cancer. Well, the funny thing is the doctor is not the enemy. He's not the one that gives you the cancer. He's the one that actually is going to, if you do have cancer, he's the one that you need to help you kind of walk through the whole process and to save you from all that thing. But this irrational fear came into my heart that it does affect your health. It affects your mind. It affects your relationships. It affects your ability to move forward. Your greatest potential is going to be held back because you can get trapped in fear. And so fear is deadly. I think it's the great captivator, and I'm really quite concerned. Interesting choice of words, I think, but I'm really quite concerned because in our society, I think fear is so prevalent today, more so that it's creating craziness in our world, irrational behavior, irrational conversations, tensions like we've never seen before. And it's just, we look and go, the world's going crazy. And I think the root of that is fear.
You know what I've noticed as well, Pastor Kelly, that even kids are becoming more fearful of the future. Many are believing the mainstream media, playing a lot into people's fears. Will my grandparents die from the coronavirus? Will the world end because of climate change? Any thoughts on how to instill hope and faith in our younger generation?
It's funny you'd ask that. I just heard today that they just did a survey in the US, and they discovered that the people that are most vulnerable and should be the most afraid of the virus are the ones that are least afraid. And in fact, the study showed that the older you are, the less or the more resilient you are, and the less fearful you are in these circumstances. And that really, this virus and the lockdowns and the media and all the rest of feeding this is feeding a lot of fear into our young people. And I think that's dangerous. And they said one of the things, and they're pressing into why the older generation is less fearful than the younger generation. What's the tension here? But I think as we age, we go through things and going, I made it through that. I survived that. This is not going to be a problem. I've made it through this trial. I can do that. And so sometimes we can have, just through the act of courage and going through a process, we will learn and we become more bold and saying, yeah, I can survive that. I can survive this. And I think for young people, a lot of it is, the fear is just lack of experience or just naiveness as to, is this big, and realizing, I mean, I think you realize, like I realize, that, the media is getting paid by fear. They get more hits if they can create more sensational headlines and more fear. That companies will actually sell and make more money based on fear. They'll drive this fear of you not having that, and they know that it makes money, so fear sells. And because of that, our whole society is so adept to fear that we don't even realize it's fear anymore that's motivating us.
Do you think it's really important to make a list of things we're thankful for to take the focus off of fear and maybe more onto appreciation?
Yeah, again, it becomes what you focus on. So if you focus on what you don't have, you're going to be susceptible to fear. If you focus on missing out, you're going to be susceptible to fear. So Paul said it in Philippians, right? He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition. So he said, okay, present every situation to God and saying, okay, I trust you. That's number one. But then he says, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And it's so important that he said with thanksgiving, because why is that? Well, thanksgiving shifts your focus to what I do have, the strength I have, the things that are good, the things that I'm thankful for. And that shift of focus, I think, gives us the courage to be able to move ahead.
Some recent stats we dug up from Statistics Canada also talks about the fact that less and less couples are getting married these days. Apparently, one of the main reasons given was the fear of getting divorced. Your thoughts?
Yeah, again, it's what you focus on. So we have this what if scenario in our head all the time and going, well, what if it doesn't work out? Well, that's a crazy thing. Like, what if it does? Like, what you're missing out if you don't move ahead. So, like, you're afraid of missing out, so you don't move at all. And that's how fear works. It's just completely irrational. And I think the fear of commitment, and a lot of that is driven by, and a lot of our fears are driven by past pains. So these young people who have seen a divorce or lived through a divorce as a child, saying, I don't want that, and that past pain is now feeding this fear ahead, instead of saying, hey, I saw that mistake, I can learn from that mistake, and I saw what didn't work, and I'm going to apply this so that it will work. Is again what you focus on, you're going to give power to.
So, Pastor Kelly, any final advice for viewers who are struggling with fear today?
Yes, absolutely. I think the greatest advice that we can do, this is what's worked for me, and this is actually my whole story about going to the doctor. This is kind of how I got myself out of that fear. Is a lot of times fear is fed by the what ifs. So what if I get cancer? And so my advice to people is, identify the what ifs and replace it with God is. So what if I get cancer? Well, God is my healer. Well, what if I lose my job? Well, God is my provider. Well, what if? And whatever the what if is, the Bible has the answer. And again, it shifts my focus, but it puts my trust in God. So I'd encourage everybody that if you're battling with fear, and let's just be honest, all of us do. This is not something that's anyone's exempt from. But when we battle with fear, just replace your what if with God is.
I love that. He's our comforter and our provider. Kelly Stickel, the lead pastor of My Victory Churches in Lethbridge and Southern Alberta, thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Hal. This has been great.